I have been given the task of sharing today's first session, and I definitely think that Professor Melnikova's presentation was a brilliant start for this session, and not narrow at all, but really opening up the perspectives for our three papers in this session. And we start with Karl Joosep Pihel. And I'm not sure if, I don't know him. There you are, it's you. Okay. So, Karl Joosep Pihel is a PhD student in Semiotics and Cultural Studies at Tartu University. And in his doctoral thesis, he focuses on, quote, the synthesis of modern-day diagrammatology, modern-day diagrammatologic studies, excuse me, and musical semiotics to explain the prevalence of analogy type musical meaning through a Persian semiotics. Karl Joosep has also written about the relationship between space or the representation of space and motion in his MA thesis. And he also before studied musicology at the Estonian Academy of Music and Theatre. So, Karl Joosep, the floor is yours.
I hope my questions.
That is my USB.
Oh, it is. Authentically, I emailed.
Use music.
It's in slides. Hello. So I hope my presentation will flow nicely with precisely the question asked at the end of this live presentation. Not quite happy with the title of my talk, but hopefully it will become clear what I'm talking about during it. First of all, I find it a bit difficult to speak of music without having the shared experience of having listened to it. So in the spirit of multimodality, and since the piece I'm looking at is a very short piano piece by Estonian composer Heino Eller, I thought hopefully we can listen to it. Titled The Butterfly. It's a rather popular piece in Estonia, at least. It consists of three parts in an ABA structure, to give you a primer, where the A structure repeats at the end, and in the B structure is a contrasting middle section, developmental middle section. In my research, I come to music with mainly this question of how does music represent, or how can it be heard as representing some object of experience or imagination, or maybe what is butterfly like in this music? You hear it as a butterfly. I think it's relatively unproblematic to say with the paratextual context here, the title, what this music represents, even if we consider the difficult problems of musical representation. So first of all, it would be interesting to note perhaps that there are very salient similarities between the strategies employed by Eller and, well, butterfly thematics in Western piano music history. And I have a little historical excursion here as well, very short examples. First of all, from Schubert's song, Der Schmetterling. Here of interest is the piano accompaniment and not the vocal melody. And the salient feature is this simple accompaniment feature, particular up and down musical motion in the accompaniment, which I have dubbed the fluttering motif. We will see it again and again. For example, in Chausson's song, we see a very similar phenomena. That is the fluttering motif in a static harmonic, accompanying the vocal throughout. And as you can hear at the end there, it starts also moving up and down in the register of the piano. This has a precursor in purely instrumental keyboard music, François Couperin, Papillons. I will not play them all, but here you can see a very similar up, down, up, down, up, down motion constantly throughout the entire piece. The same thing in Robert Schumann. A bit later, this fluttering motif is combined with a melodic motion. And it gets more complicated as the 19th century moves on. In Greek, this fluttering motif is already a bit hidden. You can see it here in the dotted rhythms. It's a bit hard to hear. That upper note is a bit difficult to hear, but it's there. And in other places of the piece as well, here combined with a sort of linear melodic figuration and also arpeggiated chordal figuration. And even in pieces where we might not hear it immediately, it's there in a hidden way. Here there is no sense of this repeating figure, but actually if you look at the two-note patterns here, if we were to play it in the same octave, the same register, it would be da 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 da. But here it is simply dispersed throughout the octaves to have a sort of very virtuosic example. And finally, it sort of, I suppose, culminates with Ravel's music in his Nocturnes from Miroas, where there are various different textures, but again, this up, down, fast, light motion is prevalent in many occasions. So having done this sort of little historical excursion, placing Eller's piece in an intertextual field that seemed to have similar strategies of representation, we could say we have a case for a more or less stable musical signifier, and we might say that it's more or less arbitrary. And so that is what is meant by musical topics. We might ask why this strategy, and purely intuitively, is there not something motivated about this strategy of depicting musical butterflies, let's say. Some of the salient musical features here, not all of them, I can't make a thorough analysis of all these pieces, but they have a very fast tempo, they have rapid musical values, light dynamics, often the texture, meaning how accompaniment and melody is presented, is static and simple. That is a melody in profile over a very simple and not very noticeable accompaniment. This Fortspinnung and perpetuum mobile are sort of terms sometimes used in musicology, meaning that it's this constant motion, not stopping. And finally, the prevalence of this fluttering motif. So when asking this question, I come to a more like experiential side of this reception of this music. And in doing so, I also turn to Semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce. I have here a quote by Mark Raybrook: "The role of musical experience has for a long time been marginal in existing musicological research. There are psychological studies and music reception and cognition studies, but musicology as a discipline is still waiting for a comprehensive, theoretically grounded framework that explains the idiosyncrasies and commonalities of real-time musical sense-making." But there, in fact, has been a rise in the experiential dimension in the study of music in all its aspects, particularly also in music semiotics. This embraces theories of externalization, embodiment, corporality, and those are the main key terms, as well as individual biographies of composers, performers, listeners, as well as other disciplines such as theories of performance, neurosciences, and cognitive sciences. And in accordance with the theme of this conference, Philip Tagg has put it quite nicely that music is a particularly synesthetic and holistic type of human expression, meaning that it engages, even in pure music, purely the sound engages us multimodally, and I will come to this now. So first, in slight violation with Peircean architectonics, I come to the index and the indexical features of sound to explain this. Sound, as heard, for example, in piano performance, is an indexical phenomenon. Sound is one of the best examples of indexes, I think, because it is so intimately tied to the physical event that creates it. There is pure physical sort of causality at work there. So they stand for some individual event or object that produces it. Found in this conception, at least in the physical environment, is always an index of physical motion and forces of some sort. Most signs are, of course, composites of different aspects of the famous trichotomy of icon index symbol. They are not logically exclusive categories. So a pure index is pretty difficult to imagine. Peirce states as much, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to instance an absolutely pure index, or to find any sign absolutely devoid of indexical quality. A pure index in music could be a pure presence. Sound is a pure presence. And David Lidov has conceptualized it as dynamics, intonation, tempo, rubato, phenomena such as that. But most of the time, sound also carries information about the event that produces it. Since no sound can be produced and no touch felt without movement, energy, and mass in space, says Philip Tagg, all anaphones should be ideally sorted under the main heading kinetic. An anaphone for him is a meaningful musical sound that uses existing models in its formation. And the keen viewer will see that this has a very diagrammatic quality, this description of this musical sound. So indexes convey information. Here we might turn to the Peircean distinction between genuine index and degenerate index as discussed by Atkin, wherein a genuine index contains an icon or is instantiated in an icon, which enables us to gain information. Then going to Lidov, we might say that music is a genuine index in this sense. The iconic is an articulated shape that may be interpreted as the isomorph or trace of some object or force, not immediately in contact with it. It is the performer who then reconnects them, indexes them to the body, and thereby reveals their force. And here, Lidov probably means, in speaking of this articulated shape, he means the musical score, which demands the performer to instantiate it in sound in genuine indexes. So how does this play a role in musical perception? I turned here to Arne Cox, who does not have specifically a semiotic outlook, but rather comes to it from the perspective of Lakoff and Johnson's cognitive metaphor theory and image schema. But he states that musical perception and meaning is mainly mimetic for him. That is, we mimic sound and the physical exertions that produce sound. Either explicitly, we can react with our body, or implicit imitations are also possible for him, meaning the mimesis can be covert and imaginative, corresponding to the question, what is it like to do that? What is it like to produce this sort of sound? He called it mimetic motoric imagery. So I might say that this includes some sort of creative, maybe abductive inference via motoric sensation. I hear this piano piece, I think, what is it like to produce these sounds? Some extremes of sound are easy for us, I think, to imagine producing. A very loud bang will have a sort of purely by being physical bodies in physical environments, we have a pretty good idea of what the sensation is of producing such a sound, or the very light and fast motion of tapping sounds, for example. But of course, this can be a lot more precise if I have specific knowledge about playing a certain instrument, for example. And similar points have been made by others who write in music semiotics. Tagg speaks of gestural interconversion, which he conceptualizes as a two-way process between music and external phenomena that rely on the commonality of a gesture. Compares the projection of an internal sensation via appropriate gesture to an external phenomena and the internalization of an appropriate or appropriation of external phenomena through the medium of a gesture, corresponding some way to the perceived form, shape, movement, grain density, viscosity of this external phenomena. Similarly, Hutton has written on musical gesture. Common to all of these approaches is this idea that what we might call motoric imagery is what enables us to map between, for example, the heard phenomena and visual imagination, for example, or other modalities. Or to put it more evocatively, simply because I like this quote by Merleau-Ponty. The gesture I witness sketches out the first signs of an intentional object. This object becomes present and is fully understood when the powers of my body adjust to it and fits over it. The gesture is in front of me like a question. It indicates to me specific sensible points in the world and invites me to join it there. To me, the ending of this quote becomes quite evocative of a diagram of gesture as well. So I don't have time, sadly, to go into an analysis of the piece we heard at the beginning. But to ask what is the nature of this iconic isomorph that Lidov talked about that is indexicalized by the performer? Well, in music, mainly, we could see it as a diagram of relations formed by pitch classes, rhythmic durations, dynamics, and so on. That is, here being a diagram, conventional ways of understanding these relations and representing them, of course, plays a role. Mainly in Western culture, our tendency to present pitch space as a vertical space, for example, and time as the horizontal vector, resulting in images of contours and trajectories. And this is quite clear in how these various examples of butterfly music seem to model some sort of contour by their focus on this melodic profile, which I have sketched here. But this is not the only way to conceptualize it, of course. When performing the piece and repeating this opening gesture, which I can do. It's circular motion as well, if we look at what my hand does. And it also contains indexical motoric information implicitly via this notion of mimetic motoric imagery, meaning this is what Tag calls fine motoric kinetic anaphone, meaning sound produced by slight motions, such as by the fingers. And these dimensions of genuine diagrammatic indexes interact with what we might say is the properly musical, conventional harmonic and tonal structures in music. Thereby, also what Hutton says is the musical gesture combines all of these dimensions, iconic, indexical, and symbolic. For example, in the beginning gesture of this piece, there is also a sort of tonal descent from the third degree of the scale here through the second degree down to the first. So a sort of descent to the tonally stable E flat pitch. creating a sort of composite of this idea of a flight trajectory and a descent. And how this relates to this representation of the butterfly here, I propose, this is the last slide I will finish, a sort of tentative connotative model whereby this indexical iconic information derived from sound experience and through motoric inference plays a role in how we perceive this virtual imaginary butterfly, its movement and qualities. Of course, then additional connotative layers build upon this initial sign experience with regard to various cultural connotations that a butterfly might have, for example. And I will finish it. Thank you for your time.
Okay, questions?
Yes, I would have one, and also some suggestions in terms of using or making use, articulating Peirce's theory of signs, of how to better grasp the musical movements, and from which perspective also to do that. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay. So I will try to be brief. I mean, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting, very elucidative. And my first suggestion is the following. I would avoid classifying music as this type of sign or that type of sign, because the signs of the second level of the trichotomy, the icons, indexes, and symbols, they are already very well-defined relations, and they are triadic relations already. And as you pointed out, indexes and icons, they are called degenerate. But there is a reason for that, and the reason lies in the first level of the trichotomies, which is the level closer to phenomenology, which is the ground of the sign, quali signs, sin signs, and legi signs, which will form then the other trichotomies. My point here is musicality, musical tones. They are much closer to this level, closer to phenomenology, and not so close to or not yet close to a hard defined relation, because they are more fluid. But nonetheless, all levels, quali, sign, sin sign, and legi sign are present in every musical presentation, because first, the qualities are being embodied, but they are embodied in the playing, and the singular playing. For example, you gave the example of the playing of piano. They are qualities being embodied here and now. So the aspect of sin sign is already there, the happening, the coup. And because we hear this as music and we interpret this as music, whatever the interpretation may be, what kind of emotional level we can have, the legi sign is already there. So we have the idea of organization as music, as musical organization. So I would suggest you to close down a little bit to the first level of the trichotomies, so you can grasp better the qualities, and you can grasp better also the fine nuances of happenings and of temporality of the music. And all of those things are represented by quali signs, sin signs, and legi signs alike. we could say, for example, that there is a great aspect of diagrammaticity in musical happenings, and this would hold also true. And my second suggestion would be, for example, to define a little bit when using the semiotical account of Peirce, for example, which is thoroughly legitimate, and I think this will be a very great contribution to musical studies, musicology, would be, for example, to analyze in different perspectives, from which perspective now is being analyzed. For instance, let me rephrase that. Is this from the perspective of a listener? Is this from the perspective of a musician playing, or is it from the perspective from a composer listening and playing at the same time and composing? So all those things also will render different nuances also for the aspects. So those are my suggestions. But then again, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting.
Yes, thank you. And I absolutely agree with these suggestions. First of all, I maybe did not emphasize enough that it is not my desire to make this distinct division between icon, index, and symbol. To say that this is such a sign in music, that is such a sign in music, and so on, but rather rely on these aspects that are present more or less in all musical signs to elucidate musical experience. And yes, I agree that this polyscience and syllabic sign trichotomy is very useful as well.
Hello. My question is, diagrams have this property that they can be manipulated even for different persons to obtain different conclusions from some phenomena that's being analyzed. Do you think that music works in a similar way? Like, I think, for example, when a jazz band gets together, they start improvising over some musical thing. They are doing some kind of diagrammatical reasoning. Would you agree with that?
From the perspective of musical discourse, for example, when we look comparatively at these various pieces depicting butterflies, I would say something like that is absolutely going on, diagrammatic experimentation. You have this initial, for example, fluttering motif, this initial idea of representing a contour of movement with melodic structures. And you can see how various composers combine this with other musical techniques and generate some basic musical narratives out of these building blocks, for example. For example, this occurred in the Heino piece, where this ABA structure that I mentioned in the beginning begins with one type of gesture, then there is an interruption, movement into a different tonal context, and then a return. So a very basic sort of narrative structure emerges of balance, thrown off balance, and back to balance. So I think, yes, this, from the perspective of the listener, I find it more difficult to conceptualize how they might diagrammatically experiment. I suppose you can compare what you hear from the music with various experiences, internal or external, that you have, and see how well does the music correspond. But experimentation proper is, of course, within the realm of text generation, and also the performer if they make some changes, for example.
I think these were very good questions. I was actually going to ask something similar myself, but now I don't have. Then we thank. And then I will introduce myself. Let's see if this works. No. Okay, can you hear me? Hello. I have written that I am going to talk about the paradox of sensory qualities as science. And now I'm actually relieved that I really didn't prepare a manuscript for this talk, because this fits in so perfectly with what Karl Joosep has said before about music, and also with the previous comments, actually. Because my main statement here will be that sensory qualities, science, especially from the point of view of art history, is a paradox only if defined from a narrow Saussurean or Hjelmslevian framework, but doesn't necessarily have to be very paradoxical. I'm going to start with the proposition of some concepts, conceptualizations of the relationship between signifiant, signifié, form, subject matter. And I want to put this into relationship with the distinction we have grown used to in semiotics, at least in European semiotics, between the figurative sign and the plastic sign in images. Everyone with some experience of making images knows that there is a dual aspect to all images. On the one hand, the image has a recognition of certain qualities of depicted objects, or recognition of a logical projection of a depicted pictorial space, referred to in the Gramscian tradition as sign figurative, the figurative sign. And on the other hand, the picture as a two-dimensional surface, an articulated two-dimensional surface, referred to as the sign plastique, the plastic sign. So this is a way in a paradox, because it means that any image is actually a sign, which is two signs. And then the status of this plastic sign is hard to define with these concepts. The classical Saussurean one of le signifiant, le signifié, constituting the sign, and on the second level, the sign, the resulting sign acting as a second signifiant in relationship to a second signifié, producing a connotation. So should le sign plastique, the plastic sign, be conceptualized as a connotation, a connotative sign? And is it that in that case an autonomous sign? Art historians used to speak of form rather than the plastic sign. And in art history, this second conceptualization is established between the form, the subject matter, and the content. The subject matter being the simple aspect of the motive, the objects depicted, the events depicted, and the content rather the wider or deeper significance of the subject matter. But then form is also used in a more narrow sense by art historians as simply implying shape with no content, like when we speak of shape, color, and shape. I think that this discussion about plastic signs being present at the same time consubstantial with figurative or iconic signs wouldn't have developed without a history of style and formal analysis in art history, the development of the history of style and formal analysis. And it would also not have happened without the later strivings of avant-garde artists toward a non-figurative visual art. But the interesting thing is that formalism in art history and in visual art evolved at the same time as modern structural linguistics and semiotics. The idea that the study of form and style could somehow be separated from the study of subject matter and content, I think has connection to the linguistic distinction between signifiant and signifié, to make a distinction between those as if they were separate. This evolved into a notion that there could be an art, a visual art of only form, a visual art with only shapes and color, and implicitly then with no content, as in l'art pour l'art. Then, in connection to linguistics, it is interesting that in the Socios pour the linguistique générale, the term image acoustique is actually used with reference to the signifiant or the plane of expression, as if this were actually an oral image. If you want, analogous to music. But this image acoustique would of course not be an image of anything without the unity and mutual relationship between sound and concept visualized by Saussure, or rather Saussure's students in this famous diagram. Likewise with a visual image, form in any other sense than purely a geometrical shape wouldn't be form without this mutual relationship with subject matter and content. I think that there is another terminology related to form which probably captures the relationship between form and subject matter and content in visual images better. Sometimes appearing in linguistic literature, for example, in the early writings of Lev Vygotsky, with its origin in Humboldt, the distinction between outer form and inner form in relation to content. But finally, I think that the most natural way of describing what a plastic sign might be, a sign which does not depict, is again this dichotomy of Charles Sanders Peirce, basically the dichotomy of the three levels of the representation, which our colleague mentioned before. The quali sign and the sin sign and the legi sign. I have written them here with inclusion signs because there cannot be a legi sign without sin signs and quali signs. This also means that the most fundamental level, the quali sign, must be defined as qualities. Sensory qualities as signs, and that very simple definition is the one used by Peirce himself, and defines it explicitly as sign. This is not a paradox for Peirce. So. Probably not necessary, but I took the labor to visualize the relation, the status of visual qualities in the classical model of Saussurian semiotics. If we kind of translate this to the visual cases. The Saussurian, Janslevian model of the sign visualized as a structure with a center like this, in which we have the different strata of the sign. The relationship, the basic relationship between signifiant and signifier, connected by the form. 5 minutes. Really? Did I start that? Yeah. And in which the sensory qualities as such would only be basically the substance at the top. That's different from the form. I think I was too slow. But the real hero of my presentation here, I think, is this person, Meyer Shapiro, who actually had an origin here in Lithuania. He was born in 1904 in Bodily. I think I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah. And his parents were Jews, Nathan Menachem Shapiro and Fanny Adelman Shapiro. And his ancestors were Talmudic scholars. So he came from a tradition of scholarship. Shapiro is actually one of the fathers of visual semiotics, but probably not very well remembered today. He questioned very strongly from the beginning formalism in art criticism. He was very, very interested in abstract art, contemporary abstract art. Already in his early years of study. But what he questioned was the formalism of art criticism. And some texts could be relevant for a discussion for this is both his claimed research on Romanesque sculpture in Europe, especially in France, and his texts on abstract art and his texts on semiotics. For example, his essay Nature of Abstract Art from Marxist Quarterly, Volume 1, 1937. This is a review of Alfred J. Barr, the MoMA director Alfred J. Barr's book Cubism and Abstract Art, published in 1936. And here Shapiro criticizes the dichotomy between figurative and abstract art implicit in Barr's argument. Shapiro writes, quote, Barr's conception of abstract art remains essentially unhistorical. The history of modern art is presented as an internal, immanent process among the artists. Abstract art arises because, as the author says, representational art has been exhausted. And Shapiro continues, in a Platonic manner, he opposes to the representation of objects as a rendering of the surface aspects of nature, the practice of abstract design as a discovery of the essence of underlying mathematical order of things. He assures further that the mind is most completely itself when it is independent of external objects. If he nevertheless values certain works of older naturalistic art, he sees in them only independent formal constructs. He overlooks the imaginative aspect of the devices for transposing the space of experience to the space of the canvas, and the immense historically developed capability to hold the world in mind. End of quote. Then Shapiro also comments Alfred Barr's analysis in his book of the painting by Malevich in the collections of Museum of Modern Art in New York, Black Square on Red Square from 1915. About this work, Barr wrote, quote, that it was a study in equivalence. The red square, smaller but more intense in color and more active in its diagonal axis, holds its own against the black square, which is larger but negative in color and static. I cannot see. 1 minute. 1 minute and static in position. So, end of quote. So Barr describes this as a pure abstraction. But Shapiro comments, Barr overlooks the relation of this painting to a work by Malevich reproduced in his book, Woman with Water Pails, Dynamic Arrangement from 1912-13. The peasant woman, designed in Cubist style, balances 2 pails hanging from a rod across her shoulders. Here the preoccupation with balance as a basic aesthetic principle governing the relations of the 2 conceptual units is embodied in an elemental genre subject. The objects balanced are not human, but suspended. Non-organic elements are not unarticulated forms. End of quote. And Shapiro then goes on to comment balance as a visual theme in the work of Picasso and other avant-garde painters in Paris in the beginning of the 20th centuries. The influence of non-European art on this, and concludes that, quote, in the light of this analysis, we can hardly accept Barr's account of Malevich's step into abstraction, that Barr's notion that Malevich kind of suddenly, out of the blue, invented abstraction with no previous references. So I will try to sum this up. I mean, In Shapiro's research during all his whole life, one could say that he constantly explored what he wrote about in the paper about the nature of abstract art as the devices for transposing the space of experience to the space of the canvas. But in his 1939 studies of the sculptures of Souillac, the Romanesque sculptures of Souillac from the 11th and 12th centuries, also how space is transferred into stone by these anonymous stone carvings. In such papers as we skip here, the famous article he published in Semiotica in 1969 on some problems in the semiotics of visual art, field and vehicle in image science. The basic theme was the non-mimetic elements of the image sign. The image sign, the term Shapiro used, image sign. And the role of non-mimetic images, not only in abstract art, but in all art, referred to Shapiro as art. And especially in the examples of Romanesque book illumination and sculpture, which he had studied for his thesis and in his more extensive art historical works. And also in Semiotica, regarded as one of the basic texts of visual semiotics, Shapiro still didn't define the non-mimetic qualities of visual art as signs. But I think that his work started a development in later semiotics, for example, in the work of Bodily. And that the things that Shapiro describes here and also in his later work, Words and Pictures, basically the system of the plastic organization of the image field as a system, as a semiotic system. And in order to, I have to end here. Sorry.
So I think we have 5 minutes per question.
5 minutes per question. Sorry, I realized I should have written a manuscript.
That was very interesting. I'm wondering whether you see any role for cognitive science and neuroscience to explain what the way in which we actually organize the pictorial space, the principles that underlie our perception of the plastic dimension. Because I think it seems to be a critical question to many in many respects.
Yeah.
What you think about this?
That's what I should have continued. If I had planned better. Yes, of course. I mean, if you look at the latest work by me, the Principia Semiotica from 2015, you can see there, similarly to their earlier Evripides Zantides from 1992, that they are incorporating and this group of Belgian semioticians are incorporating and reflecting the findings of neuroscience. I mean, basically medical neuroscience, but also of cognitive semiotics and cognitive theory, and also by many the work of semiotics as traité du sens visuel is also seen as kind of one of the starting points for cognitive semiotics. But it started with interdisciplinarity. I mean, if you think about the members of Group Me, there is, for example, Francis Evelyn, who is a chemist, and Pihel, who is a psychologist. So there is also this notion of empirical semiotics, and in which probably show quickly. I prepared a lot of slides there. The investigations of the graphic differential and the semantic aspects of abstract shapes and combination of abstract shapes made by Monteste in the 60s and by Martin Kram, excuse me, in the 80s, and by Martin Kram. Yes.
There are some questions from our participants online.
Yeah.
In fact, I may read them because we have little time for questions, and I see 2 more questions on Zoom on chat. So I'll quickly mention them both and we see how much we can answer. First, Ina Merkulova says, thank you for the interesting conference, and she asks, what place does Eero Tarasti's musical semiotics and existential semiotics occupy in your studies? And another question from, forgive me.
The question is not for credit, so.
Yeah, there's another question. Sorry?
The question is not for credit, it was for Karl Joosep.
It could probably be for both of us.
Well, in some sense, it applies. There's another question from Victor Melas asking, what does it mean inner form in visual art? I think we can know the Eero Tarasti question first.
Yeah. No. I'll ask the question first. What is it? You don't want to answer?
If you'd like to briefly comment on the question Eero Tarasti, then we can move to the next presentation. Okay.
Yes. As I said, probably the Persian perspective is more fruitful, and then the path of Tarasti would be interesting. Yes. The second question. No, I'm not exactly sure how to answer it, actually. Could you rephrase it?
Well, maybe you can chat with Mr. Tumelas on the matter of form in visual art.
Pardon?
Maybe you can ask later, you can chat directly with the person for the question. You'll find it on the
I mean, that is difficult because probably the inner form of visual art, I think, could be understood more clearly, also in relationship to Bodily and the notion of iconoclastic rhetoric in Group Me. I mean, the constant interaction between the figurative and the plastic, which is also something foreshadowed already in the research of Maya Shapihu, as I see it. That it is not a question of a totally separate, totally autonomous plastic system. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
And sorry, Evripides, I feel I took up too much time here. But I will next introduce a brilliant scholar, Evripides Zantides, who is a professor of graphic design and visual communication at the Cyprus University of Technology. Professor Zantides has published widely and presented a number of research papers at conferences. He is the country delegate for Cyprus for the International Association of Semiotic Studies and for Association Typography International. And he is also the founder and director of the Semiotics and Visual Communication Research Lab at the Cyprus University of Technology. Evripides, the floor is yours.
The screen is mine. Thank you very much. And thank you for the acceptance at the conference and all the organizers for this hybrid organization. I suppose you can hear me well. Or you can see my screen, okay, Paulius?
Yeah, we can see and hear you all.
Okay. Just a brief introduction to the work of comics. MacLeod, in his now classic in the field book, defined comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. For Rigaud and all, comic books are a widespread cultural expression and are commonly accepted as the ninth art. The art of comics began in the middle of the 19th century and developed largely out of 18th and 19th century caricature and mid-19th century British humor magazines. According to a series of studies, comics are a hybrid medium which combines textual and visual information to communicate their narrative and tell a range of different stories, including horror, science fiction, and children's tales of funny animals, superheroes, and adventures. Comics are characterized by the combination of both text and pictures with a relatively small number of words and the sequential order of these images organized into units graphically separated from each other. The pictures in a comic are the visual narrative and the words are the textual narrative. A comic is composed of panels, scattered speech or thought balloons and captions. According to MacLeod, the most widely used, most complex and most versatile of comics, mainly an aesthetic icon, is the word balloon. Comic speech and thought are reported directly and the language is usually personal and brief, even though significant proportions of it are essentially narrative. It shows that the character is speaking in the first person, and this makes the readers involved in the story much deeper. Balloon shapes contribute to the overall meaning and narration, and their role in the semantic sphere of comic books is very important. There are many variations in balloon shape, while many new ones are invented every day. At the same time, inside the balloons, symbols are constantly being appropriated or inverted in order to cover the non-verbal. According to Rigaud and all, the tail of the balloon indicates the character who is speaking or thinking. The inside area of the balloons is usually light to improve readability, and they are surrounded by a black outline contour. This contour has a particular shape that conveys the intonation of the text. The four most common speech balloons are those for speech, whisper, thought, and scream. Based on their investigation, Forsyth and all observed that besides verbal text, balloons can contain A, standalone punctuation marks, typically question marks and exclamation marks, indicating a character's surprise, shock, or confusion. B, pictograms, which is visual representations with a fixed context, dependent meaning, for example, a $sign, and pictorial rules, that is flourishes such as speed lines, droplets, and spirals to indicate emotion. And C, non-speech vocalizations and onomatopoeias, which differ across languages. The investigation of fonts and styles in balloons indicated that each comic has a standard balloon typeface, plain, bold, or italics, while there could be some deviations from the standard typeface comprised, such as various degrees of bold font, non-standard italics, different styles, font and or sizes for different words within a balloon, and letter contours that are angular, curved, compressed, or otherwise deviant. The balloon's tail usually points to a visible source within the panel. However, there are instances where the balloon's tail points to a non-visible source within the panel or to a source outside the panel. In some cases, the balloon's tail crosses the gutter to point to an identifiable source in another panel. According to Eisner, the text in comics is read as image. Particularly, hand-drawn lettering or created with type is graphically treated to serve the story as an extension of the imagery. While text enhances the mood in this context, it functions as a narrative bridge to imply sounds. In the example we observe that the title, Nitroglycerin, in this Lucky-Luke edition, is carefully reflecting through the placement of its condensed serif capital letters the notion of a fragile movement, which is the action that forces the specific liquid to explode. This is also enhanced by the explosive jagged contour balloon that frames the title. Similar also is the concept with Daisy Town, all red, whereby the distorted zigzag uppercase letters reflect the story inside, that is, of a new town that will inevitably attract criminals of all kinds. While hand lettering will always be the most idiosyncratic and expressive means of inserting words into balloons and text panels, what goes inside the balloon reflects not only the nature and emotion for speech, but according to Eisner, also that of the character speaking. As we observe in the current slide, a very good example in Asterix the Legionary portrays the ethnicity of the speakers through the shape of the Greek alphabet letter forms, imitating ancient Greek, Gothic, and Egyptian. Interestingly, in this example, we have both forms of writing, the alphabetic and the ideographic. When it comes to onomatopoeia, we will see that sometimes the case is to have a hybrid combination of the aforementioned two systems. But what exactly is onomatopoetic typography and how iconic can it be? Science refers to onomatopoeia as the representation or imitation in language of sounds from the natural world rendered according to a language's phonetic inventory, phonological rules, and sociopolitical practices. For example, a telephone ringing in English-spoken countries might be ring ring, whilst in Greek is dridri. Similar would be the case in the example of this Alka-Seltzer slide advertisement, where the serious lowercase center plop plop fizz fizz would probably be glup glup fizz fizz in Greek. For Wales, onomatopoeia is the lexical process of creating words which actually sound like their referent, and it is comics device par excellence to suggest sound. There is a cross-cultural similarity in onomatopoeia since, for instance, English and French animals presumably make the same noise, as do heavy doors being slammed or objects being hit. Other sounds, such as sirens, train whistles, doorbells, or telephones, have stronger cultural specific dimensions. However, onomatopoeia is not always realistic. A large number of sound effects are creative in the sense that they are rarely present outside of comics, and their form thus allows for a great deal of variation. Holman describes the process of creating such onomatopoeias as inventing phonetics. Onomatopoetic words in comics are often rendered in a font that at the very last deviates from standard fonts, but may also draw on visual qualities such as color, non-aligned letters, and different sizes. One of the best-known works of pop art, One, is a 1963 diptych painting by Roy Lichtenstein, which portrays a classic example of a visualized sound of a flying jet fighter while shooting down other jet planes. To examine the semiotic dimensions of typography inside or outside the balloon, like in examples of onomatopoetic texts, we introduce the theoretical framework of Jacques Pepin and his realization on the ways that graphic variables can be treated to control the visual signification of maps. Particularly, 7 signification parameters are examined in cartographic design, and they are implemented to the way that letter forms look and treated typographically. These are shape, size or scale, value or tone, texture, color, orientation, and placement. As one would expect, of course, the presence of one of these variables coexists with some of the others. However, as we will realize through the examples that follow, depending on the signification purpose, one of the 7 semiotic dimensions usually prevails. Shape, therefore, refers to the forms and shape characteristics that letter forms have, uppercase or lowercase, and variation in font shapes. In the first example on the left, we observe that the futuristic and scientific fiction dimensions of E17 exterminator words are clearly evident by the specific typefaces and colors taken from the semiosphere of digital iconography. We list in the onomatopoetic example of Asterix versus Caesar, the lettering style and distorting treatment of the lower parts of the uppercase serif fonts imply dysphoria and bad noise coming out of the instruments. The second parameter, size, has to do with the scale that linguistic messages take, how big or small they are, and also through length, the space they occupy. In the general accident example, the notion of speed, terror, and accident is portrayed not only through the perspective, the balloons, the color, clouds, and lights in the composition, but mainly through the variation in size. Similar is the case with the onomatopoetic typography crying of the dog, where the decrease of letter size reflects the holding characteristic of the sound in the second example with obelisks. The third one, value, examines the various tones of shades, various degrees or changes from light to dark in the writing of linguistic texts. Usually, a degrading color is typographically used to reflect or change in a clever way the linguistic meaning of a word, like in the example of Christopher Scott's poster on lies, where a double meaning coexists in the same word through this tone variation of the background color, reflecting in this way a latent reality that is often hidden behind likes in social media. In the second example of the amazing Spider-Man, the gradient color of the onomatopoetic sound of the explosion deviates from red to purple, portraying in such a way the loudness of the sound from major impact to reduction through the grading of color at the upper areas of the letter forms. The fourth one, texture, refers to variations in patterns within the letter forms and changes within the letter form area. The visualized gunshot sound in the example of Frank Miller's Sin City, The Hard to Buy is a fascinating combination of image and text challenging our perception. Using black illustrations as textures within oversized outline capital sans serif fonts, we observe two semiotic functions happening simultaneously in the onomatopoetic words bam, bam, bam. On one hand, the typography emphasizes the loudness of the gunshots in such an effective, bold way, and on the other, we are experiencing a close-up illustration of a gun and a visual narrative that immerses our senses in the actual scene. In another example of a Lucky Luke comic book titled The Stagecoach, we observe an ornamental pattern in the uppercase serif Didon typeface of the Greek lettering. Such a strong contrast between thick and thin lines in the letter forms and the decoration inside reflect the spirit and time of the American Northwest where the narrative is taking place. The fifth one is color. Color has to do with color appearances, changes in hue at given equal values. It is common knowledge that color is a very strong semiotic mode on its own, and in the case where letters are colored in comic books, they are meant to contribute to the linguistic meaning of the words they form. In the example of Frank Miller's Holy Terror, the cutout shaped typefaces with black splashes around them are in red, of course, to enhance the fear and violence of the story. Interestingly, a black shadow behind the letter forms gives a three-dimensional impression to the title and aims to create a notable interpersonal impact with the readers. In the onomatopoetic example of an explosion in the Amazing Spider-Man on the right, we observe yellow as a sign for an intensive flashing light. It is also used in combination with speeding lines and letter size increment, alongside with shapes that contribute to this specific action of explosion. The sixth one has to do with orientation and refers to the angle and changes in alignment of written text ranging from the vertical to the horizontal. Much onomatopoeias depend to a great extent on the angles that their letter forms use to convey meaning. Depending on the sound that needs to be visualized, as well as regards to the illustration of the running narrative, orientation is used to create action, urge, or movement, like in the example with Obelix, whilst in the Amazing Spider-Man on the right, the purpose seemed to be the embracement and emphasis of the robot exit sound. And finally, last one, but of equal importance, is planar placement, which explores the various changes in the positioning of the written text along the X and Y axis, looking at placement in the design space. Such a treatment of onomatopoetic type is alongside the effect or the consequences of a visualized sound and can often be used to join together different scenes of the story. In the Asterix example, we can see how the disturbing sounds of Cacophonix, the village park, are visualized through the shapes, size, and orientation of the letters. However, it is through placement that the wave sound continues and causes the astonishment of the female soldiers. And we finalize with, we realize as a concluding remark to all 7 observations that there are infinite combinations to the various semiotic ways that typography can visualize sounds. While some graphic variables are used intensively for specific noises, in most of the cases, the result is a synergy among the many. Nevertheless, we can do some general onomatopoetic comments through alignment of functions to the variable as follows: shape for the iconicity of sound, size for volume and sound emphasis, value or tone for micro treatment of sound, color for sound persuasion, orientation for action to urge or emphasis of sounds, and finally, placement for connection, influence, and sound consequences. Moreover, we are also in the process of conducting a content analysis of a larger corpus to extract patterns of sound visualizations in respect of the 7 semiotic graphic variables. In other words, this is an ongoing project that we are still working on it. Thank you very much. I hope it was audible and interesting to the audience.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you also.
Any questions here?
You always have questions.
That's a problem.
I might have a question.
Is that?
Should I?
Yeah, you should.
Should. I mean, thank you very much for this presentation. I know you work more from marketing research, so I am surprised, happily surprised to see that you are now researching comics. But at the same time, I think themes are coming back from your previous research. Actually, I want to a bit egocentrically probably connect to my mention of group me by asking in what relationship does your taxonomy of typographic variation, what relationship does it have to the visual rhetoric of group me? Is there any?
Yes, it's still under examination. The idea is to align these dimensions with specific sounds and actually extract the answer to your question at a later stage. But the idea is to find patterns through a more intensive content analysis of these representations of these onomatopoeias and see how these variables are statistically used with significant representation to extract specific sounds, to textualize, to visualize certain genres of sounds.
Yeah, but what I was thinking is all this really so much about sound? Because I think that what you are presenting is also the systematicity of plastic organization, visual plastic organization more generally.
Plastic organization, you mean the connotative?
Pardon?
You're referring to the connotative dimension of typography, the plastic?
No, probably we are speaking different languages actually.
Maybe.
Using different terms for the same things, which is also a bit interesting. No, should we say topological then? That I mean the graphic, the semiotic of graphic organization is not necessarily about sound. If I put the question that way.
I'm not sure if I understand it well. I hear organization, and the first before that is plastic organization.
Yeah, or graphic organization.
Yes. So
there's how should I phrase this? Is your main focus really on the verbal oral dimension or on the graphic dimension?
okay. Yes, it's on both. But what is fascinating in my research is the visualization of verbal language, the way that something oral, something verbal becomes visual and has a form based on the alphabetical system.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that is often underestimated in the visual studies. Very often we see research in the linguistic meanings and their relationship to images and vice versa, but we don't often come across with investigations on the way that these linguistic messages are visualized and how the graphic design aspect contributes to the denotative, but also the connotative meaning of the messages that exist. Maybe, for example, in an advertisement or a website or a logo or an application.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions from Zoom or from the audience? No. Let me give our thanks to
Thank you.
the